It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for attending, and we will go right into the webinar today. Since this is the second of a two-part series, and it's been a few months since part one happened, although you can watch the recording on Metro's YouTube channel, we are going to do a very short recap of part one. So it's totally okay if you were there and you have a brain like a sieve like mine and you don't remember anything about part one, or if you didn't attend part one at all, or if part one is in your very long YouTube queue. I'm going to do a quick recap of that before we go into the new content for part two today. And part one was looking kind of at a 10,000-foot view where we were thinking about what are these larger climate change issues and how do they impact libraries? And then how does this work within the context of New York City? If there's anyone who's attending today who's not from New York, please don't leave the call. You will still get a lot out of this, especially with today's webinar, because I'm going to talk about not just New York City relevant resources, but also things that are relevant to wherever you are in the world that you can tap into. So if part one was sort of the 10,000-foot view, looking at the big picture, today is when we're going to zoom in a little bit, and we're going to get deeper into the details. We're going to look at some actual examples, and we're going to have you hopefully leave here with a little bit of a sense of how you might get started in this work. There are lots of people who are now working in climate change and libraries, and there's no right way or wrong way to approach this work. But what I do find is that a lot of times people feel a little bit overwhelmed and they don't know where to start. And so I do have an exercise that you can take with you at the end of today's workshop, just to get a sense of, I feel overwhelmed. I have no idea where to start. And this will help you give you some direction to figure out where to go. So this webinar series, this two-part webinar series, comes out of a report that I did with Metro about a year ago. So from February to June of last year, I worked with Metro, and we set out to answer a few different questions. The first is how climate change is impacting Metro's region, so Greater New York City and Westchester County. What is already happening among Metro's member libraries? So what are these libraries already doing about climate change? And then where are there some gaps that exist? So this research takes place over the first half of 2023. And it involved looking into existing state and local climate action plans, which we'll touch on in a moment. I looked at publicly available information from Metro's member institutions. I looked at what other major library systems across the country have been doing. And then we also did some selected interviews with subject matter experts. So in part one of the webinar series, we talked a lot about the distinctions between mitigation and adaptation. These are words that I use a lot, and so I want to make sure that you understand what they mean, because once you start reading climate change stuff, you will also see these words a lot. So mitigation refers to what we do to reduce, eliminate, or prevent additional greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a few examples here on the slide. And then adaptation are those steps that we take to adapt to prepare for the climate change impacts that are already here, and that we can also expect will continue to exist in the future. So in the last webinar, we talked about how climate change hazards can impact libraries. And I think it is really important to foreground the role of people here, because a lot of times when we talk about climate change in libraries, we get sort of stuck in two areas. We tend to think about the buildings. So, what are the facilities emissions? And we're going to talk about that too in this webinar. But we really get stuck on what is the building role, what is the facility role in climate change. And also, how does climate change impact our collections? I come from a special collections and archives background, and so this is something that obviously is very top of mind for people in that field, because anytime you have increasing humidity and unpredictable weather concerns, it can lead to mold outbreaks among rare materials if they are not in a well-managed storage environment. So obviously we don't want our collections, particularly of our rare materials, to be vulnerable to those types of damages. However, with all of that focus on the facilities and collections, sometimes we lose sight of what makes libraries so important and such vital institutions, not just institutions, but infrastructure, right? And that is the role of people. So how does climate change impact the users who are relying on our libraries? And also, how does climate change impact the staff who make up the libraries and make libraries as important as they are? So we can already see examples of this, right? We know that in many places around the country, libraries often serve as cooling centers during heat waves. And what do we know about most places in the United States? They are going to experience more heat waves. And so that has a lot of implications, particularly for public libraries, if they're increasingly being asked to step into that role of serving as cooling centers. But also, one of the things that is not always something we think about as a climate change impact, because sometimes we think climate change impacts disasters, hazards, emergencies. Climate change can also do things like making the weather weirder and less predictable. And if you have staff that are required to report on site, which is true for many libraries, right? Even though many libraries now have an increasingly remote workforce, not all of the library staff can work off site. And so many of them do have to commute on site. And think about, that example that happened in New York last year, although I think it is probably now occurring potentially a few times a year, where when there is a massive, massive rain downpour, as this headline from the New York Times states, it can wreak havoc on mass transit, right? And that's because so much of our infrastructure was designed for the climate of the last century, and our infrastructure cannot, as it is currently built, keep up with the current needs of today. And so this is something that I would really like to see more library leaders engaging with, is the safety of library staff in the context of climate change. So if there is something like this happening, right, rain wreaking havoc on the transit system, or here in Cincinnati, we had a really freak rainstorm a few years ago, very far from any rivers, and there were entire highway and road areas that were completely flooded that no one had ever seen flood before, just because there was so much rain in a short period of time. And so if you have staff that are commuting back and forth to their work site, how do you make sure that they can do that safely, right? If you have transit system shutdowns, or if roads start getting closed on a more regular basis. So these are things that we really need to factor into the way our libraries operate. And then on a longer term scale, we know that library leaders may also grapple with relocation decisions in the long run, particularly in areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise, or that have changing use patterns, because maybe people are moving into or moving out of an area due to climate change migration patterns. So let's talk about assessing trends and policies, because climate change is happening to all of us. It's happening everywhere. But the way it is showing up in different places is different, right? Based on local environments. So it's really important to understand what it looks like in a local context for where you are. These are just a handful of tools that you can use, and I think these slides are going to be available, so you will have access to all of these links. But there are tons of climate change visualization tools, models, websites out there. And the way that they typically work is that you put in your zip code, your county, some other information, maybe your address about a particular location. And then these tools will tell you over a period of time, given different scenarios, here is what you might be able to expect based on the data we have available today. So we're going to take a quick look at that first one in the next slide. But the second one, I just want to mention, it is from an organization called AIC, which is the American Institute for Conservation. For those of you who work in conservation, or you might be a preservation librarian, you are very familiar with AIC. But they recently put together a mapping project that is specifically designed for organizations with cultural heritage resources. So you might want to check that out. I was part of that advisory board. And then the New York City Flood Hazard Mapper might be of interest to those of you in New York, because it has, you can put in different parts of New York and find out what the flood hazards are in that particular area. But let's take a look at this first one here, the CMRA tool, because this is one that actually, if you look at climate change resources on the White House website, it often links out to this tool. And it's one that I'm increasingly using in my work. So let me just explain what you see here. This is just a screenshot. If you put in a county, for example, what you see, and this is the standard view that you typically see no matter where you put, no matter what location you put in. So you would see climate hazards ranging from extreme heat, drought, wildfire, flooding, and coastal inundation. Now, those hazards are sort of the baked in standard hazards list. And depending on what location you put in, there may be no information available under a certain tab. So if I put in my hometown of Cincinnati, where I am, I'm not going to see a lot of information about coastal inundation. However, if you are living on the East Coast or the Gulf Coast and you put in your location, you will get quite a bit of information about coastal inundation. But the information you see here, so if you look in the middle of the screen, then you can look at, you can set the projections for a certain period of time, right? So early century through 2044. Seems like a long period of time from now, but actually in climate modeling, that's a pretty short period of time. So 20 years from now. And the lower emissions and higher emissions scenarios, that is something that you see a lot in climate change policy work. So you will see scientists and policymakers say, okay, there are many different pathways that our whole society can take over the coming years, right? We might all decarbonize everything overnight. Probably not going to happen, but it's possible, right? We have the science and technology to do it. We just need to get the political will. So if we decarbonize, we all transition to fossil or to green energy, renewable energy, and we stay that way, that is what is in the ballpark of a lower emissions pathway. Higher emissions pathways basically look like we keep burning as many fossil fuels as we currently are, and in some scenarios, it might even be an increase from what we are doing today. So when you look at climate change modeling, it's very typical that you will see different types of emission scenarios. And that's because we can't totally predict the future, but we can sort of say, okay, if we follow this pathway, this is what we can expect. If we follow another pathway, this is how much worse it could be. And if you take a look at that line I have highlighted here, where it says the lower emissions pathway results in 25.1 days that exceed 90 degrees. So, you know, that's heat wave territory, right? 25.1 days versus 26.5 days. Now, that doesn't seem like a huge difference, right? It's about a day and a half. But over time, you can see if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that once you get out further, right, further than 20 years from now, and you start looking at a century, you can see that the degree of difference between a lower emissions pathway and a higher emissions pathway really the gap between the two widens quite vastly over time. So that's why it's really important for us to think about different types of emissions pathways. The final thing I want to point out in this screenshot that you're looking at is if you take a look at the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a number there. It's pretty small type. So I feel like I'm back at the eye doctor, right? Can you read what's the lowest line you can read on the screen? I think it says 58.7% of population in disadvantaged communities. And that is really important because when we are talking about climate change, there is the concept of environmental justice and climate justice, which is a recognition that the people in the communities that are often disproportionately impacted by climate change have typically contributed the least in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So understanding where those communities are located in the context of extreme heat days, in the context of flooding, in the context of all these things we're looking at is really important because we don't want to have a world in which the climate solutions that we are rolling out only impact the people that are already pretty well off. And we need to keep those who are in disadvantaged communities at the forefront of any climate solutions we are designing. So you might be wondering what climate policies exist for your area. And one of the things that we looked at in the first webinar was we looked at climate action plans. And a climate action plan is a statement of commitment, typically from an institution like a university or maybe even a hospital, or some kind of government entity, so maybe state government, local government, maybe federal government. And it talks about what commitments it is making related to mitigation and adaptation. So it might say something like the state of wherever is going to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2050 or something like that. And then it will detail all of the ways in which it will achieve that goal over the coming years. So in the city of New York, there are actually several climate action plans that kind of govern this area. So the city of New York has its own climate action plan, but then there's also a climate action plan from the state of New York, and then many, many, many institutions within New York City. Lots of universities, hospitals, other entities have their own institutional climate action plan. So if you take a look at this map website, it's kind of a cool website. You can click on a part of New York and it will tell you, here are all the climate action plans that are in effect or that cover this part of New York City. If you don't live in New York, I would encourage you to look at the Georgetown Climate Center website. So they have collected all of the climate action plans for, I don't think it goes beyond the United States, but it includes municipal and state climate action plans. So where I live in Cincinnati, my state of Ohio does not have a climate action plan. However, most of the major cities in Ohio do have their own climate action plans. And so all of those are listed on the Georgetown website. For those of you who work in higher education, there is a fantastic organization, the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Ed. They have a rating system, and it's sort of like a report card for universities and their commitments to dealing with climate change and sustainability. They are these wonderfully standardized reports that tell you not just, is this university switching over to, solar power, but it also talks about where climate change and sustainability shows up in all aspects of a university's work. So including the curriculum, right? What types of classes, what types of courses are offered related to climate change and sustainability at that university. So for those of you who work in a higher ed setting, looking at those reports is really instructive because it might give you some ideas about places you can collaborate with in your university that might otherwise have not been on your radar. And then finally, I bet many of you are familiar with the Sustainable Libraries Initiative. This is an organization that has existed for a few years now, and many of the members of the Sustainable Libraries Initiative are public libraries, but they have all sorts of members. Their organization has a member list, and it's very interesting to look at because some of these members are really small public libraries. Some of them are quite large, but they have all made different commitments to sustainability in their work. And so you can take a look at that website, get a lot of ideas, see if there are any libraries near you that are doing good work and how you might build some relationships with them. All right, so I had mentioned in the previous slide, there was that New York City climate plan mapper, so you could see where plans affect different parts of the city. So this is an example of that, and it's actually pretty cool to play with. So I definitely encourage people to check that out if you live in New York City. Here was the sustainability in higher education. So here's what one of these report cards looks like. And now we're going to talk about how you would go about embedding climate change into your work in libraries. So as I mentioned earlier, we often look at facilities, right, for carbon emissions. And this is particularly true in the context of New York. So if you look at overall national climate, or I should say national energy use, national carbon emissions, the largest sector of emissions at this point in the United States comes from transportation. That is not the case for New York City, right? Because New York City has such a large public transportation infrastructure already. So within the context of New York, the largest source for emissions are buildings. And so when you look at the sort of decarbonization, mitigation strategies for New York, because there's already so much public transportation, then really sort of the next big focus for where emissions reductions can be achieved in the context of New York is around facilities and buildings. So looking at what has already happened in the context of New York, what you see is that the largest public library systems, which of course are affected by the city's climate action plan being part of city government, they have made a lot of commitments and not just achieved them, but exceeded them of reducing their facilities emissions, which is pretty cool stuff, right? So you can take a look at the slides more in the report, which is on Metro's website. I go into this in some greater detail. So this is awesome, right? Amazing inspirational model to look at. And also, I want to have everyone sort of keep in mind that climate change doesn't begin and end with just facilities emissions and getting that under control. And the reason for that is because one of the things that I really stress in my work is that climate change is something that affects all of us. And so to a certain degree, it needs to be part of all of our jobs, right? And so if we think, well, we have the facilities people who are working on reducing emissions, so like we're good, we're doing everything we need to do about climate change, that can make us miss opportunities for education, for outreach, for rethinking our programming, rethinking our collections, all of these ways in which libraries can truly integrate climate change into all of their work. So here's an example that I have really been moved by with some of my research with Metro, is looking at the example of the Greenpoint Public Library, which is part of Brooklyn Public Library. For those of you who don't know about the local environmental context for this, Greenpoint is an area that has had a lot of environmental justice issues, a lot of pollution, and their public library has really taken it as part of their mission to do a lot of outreach, education, collections related to the local environmental history of this community. And so when you look at the BPL website, you see that there's this entire sort of collection inspired by the local environmental history of the Greenpoint area. And I think this is so cool. And also I can tell you as an archivist, this is also still relatively rare, right? I have not seen many examples in my work looking at what libraries are doing across the country of people really, of libraries, really documenting the local environmental history of their areas. So this is something that I think is a great model that I want to see more of. And we have a great example to start from with the work of the Greenpoint Public Library. So, okay, I mentioned earlier that, I had an exercise. So I know that sometimes there are some overachievers among webinar audiences. And so you might be the kind of person that actually enjoys having homework or an exercise to start with. So this part is for you. If you are overwhelmed, which everyone dealing with this work gets overwhelmed at some point. I get overwhelmed too. This is a good exercise you can do to figure out where to start. And so what you do is you ask yourself, what is already happening? What is the lived reality of where I am? And then where are there adaptation opportunities to start working towards? So when I think about all of the things that make up a library, I think about the people, right? So those are the patrons, the people who use our libraries. There's the personnel, so that's our staff, our library leaders. Then there's the stuff and the services. So stuff is your library collections, and the services are all of the things that your library might do. If you're an academic library, maybe you do instruction sessions. If you're a public library, maybe you do kids story time. So those are all the services you have. And then the storage is thinking about your facilities, right? So where are your patrons? Where are your personnel? Where's your stuff? Where's your services? That is all in some kind of facility or some kind of storage. So then you can start filling this out. And here's an example, right? So maybe you are in an area that you are noticing that people are seeking air conditioning during heat waves. Maybe they're coming to your library more. Maybe there have been rain events that have interfered with your staff commutes. Maybe there was a disaster recently and you had a lot of people coming in, checking out laptops for a while, but you didn't have enough to go around. Or maybe you are one of my comrades who is in a basement archive and it's flooding more often. So these are all things, real examples. Hopefully you don't identify with all four of these, but some of them probably resonate with you. And then you can ask yourself, where might there be opportunities for embedding adaptation? So maybe once you take a look at that city climate action plan, you notice that it mentions more funding for dealing with extreme heat events. Maybe with your personnel issues, maybe you're involved with your union at your workplace. And so you're renegotiating a new collective bargaining agreement and you start thinking about how you can revise a work from home policy to deal with these weird weather events. Maybe with the services that people are seeking during times of disaster, it's an opportunity to start building relationships with some local emergency response officials. And maybe if you're dealing with flood issues in your collection, you might not be able to change that super, on the timetable that you want to, but maybe you can identify, are there parts of the collection that we need to get out of here now? And maybe there's a temporary place where we can put some of the collection to keep it safer. So I encourage people to do that exercise because sometimes I notice when people are starting to tackle this for the first time, they get very overwhelmed, right? And they're like, I don't know where to start. And what I would say is that there is no single right place to start, but just starting somewhere often has a snowball effect and helps you sort of think about where else you can plug in. So starting somewhere is better than just spinning your wheels and doing nothing. All right, let's talk about some examples of potential collaboration. These are all real examples, which I love. So hopefully during Q&A, the chat, if anyone else has some really cool examples, please share them with me. This is like one of the more fun parts of my work dealing with climate change is collecting cool stories from other places. And sometimes we don't know about them because people are doing them, but they aren't putting them out on their websites. So the only way we know about this work is if we talk about it publicly. All right. So one of the examples I found when I was doing this work with Metro last year was New York NYU Libraries did a collaborative art exhibit, not just with faculty and students, but also community members. And I love this example because sometimes I notice when I'm in webinars like this, you get some people who really feel powerless, right? They're like, I don't have any control over the admissions. I don't have any control over the facilities. I don't have any control over hiring or purchasing or anything like that. But maybe you're in charge of a small exhibit space. And so that is an example of something that you can do to bring about some larger climate change awareness. This is a pretty cool example from the Bay Area. It's called the Bay Ren Resilient Libraries Network, and this was more of an active project a couple of years ago. And what this project did was that it brought together public libraries in underserved communities and provided them with resources to both make their library branches more energy efficient, but also to give them resources so that they could then bring those to the community and their user population for increasing energy efficiency. And of course, in the context of California, where there's a lot of electric grid stability issues in California, this is really important to reduce demands on the power grid in a place that it can be prone to blackouts and brownouts. So the Bay Ren example is really interesting since it brings together some people from like utilities and energy efficiency groups, as well as public libraries. Seed libraries, I think, are something that many of us are increasingly familiar with. So this was an example I found of Queens Public Library partnering with Queens Botanical Garden on having a seed library. I was really impressed when I did a quick internet search on this. There's way more seed libraries than I ever realized, including some close to me that I had no idea existed. So if you have not looked into this, you might want to check because there's probably a seed library near you already. And then there are a few examples of city climate action plans that have actually explicitly called out the role of libraries. And I hope this is something that we see more in the future. So this example on the left is from Los Angeles, and they talked about the role of libraries in waste reduction and achieving zero waste in the city. Then on the right-hand side, this is an example from Austin, Texas's Climate Resilience Action Plan. And it talked about the role that libraries can play in emergency situations. So as shelters and what they would need in order to do that, right? We know that libraries get called upon, particularly public libraries get called upon to sort of fill in all of these gaps in the social safety net. And so I do think it is important that when we are talking about this, we are also very clear-eyed about what libraries need in order to fill these functions. This is one of my favorite examples that I have found anywhere, which is the example of the New Orleans Preservation Coalition. So this is an organization that brings together cultural heritage workers, performing artists, and the New Orleans Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. And what they have is an emergency supply kit at one of their member locations. And if you are a member of this coalition, maybe you walk into work one day and you find that there's a burst pipe and it is all over your collections, you can go get as many materials as you need from the supply cache and then bring them back to your workplace. So this is a way for, a lot of small organizations don't necessarily have a preservation librarian. So this is an example of how a community organization has kind of made some of the resources and expertise that a preservation librarian would have available to members that might never have a preservation librarian on staff. This is also part of an organization called Alliance for Response, which is part of the American Institute for Conservation. There are Alliance for Response chapters across the country. Some of them are in varying levels of activity, but the New Orleans Preservation Coalition is one of the most active. And so if you're interested in finding out whether there is an Alliance for Response chapter near you, take a look at that website, Alliance for Response, and you can find out where the closest chapter is to you. So that is the end of my formal remarks, but I do hope that this has given you some inspiration for places, partners, ideas that you can explore. Because when we think about climate change, like if it's super overwhelming, but I promise you lots of other people are doing this work. And so I think the trick is not to think of where do I even start, but who do I talk to in order to begin doing some of the work that we could start doing.